Welcome to the Inspiring Tech Leaders podcast with me, Dave Roberts. This week, my special guest is Usman Hamid, who is the VP of Engineering and Enterprise Architecture at GSK. Usman has also held other senior technology roles at Barclays, the BBC, Redfern and QVC. Usman is a senior technology executive with hands-on experience of leading large-scale and complex technology transformations. He is passionate about end-user experiences and using technology as an enabler. He is also a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion. Usman has a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science from the Manchester Metropolitan University and an MBA from the Alliance Manchester Business School. Usman has an excellent track record of building high-performing, diverse and forward-thinking teams that are focused on execution. What a pleasure it is to have you with us here today, Usman.
Thank you for having me on, David.
Great. So how did you start your career in IT? And was it the path that you always wanted to follow?
Interesting. So when I was younger, I had dreams of being a rock star, actually. And I did that.
Didn't we all?
I actually did that for a while. So, my first passion was always music, actually. And from a very young age, I was kind of in bands, playing gigs everywhere. And we managed to get to a point when I was like 17 or so where we were able to land a record deal, actually, with the band that I was in. So I spent my early formative years kind of fully focused on music, actually. So touring up and down the country, sleeping in the back of transit vans, tour buses, people's floors, for example, bathrooms, baths, you name it. So tech was something that I enjoyed as a bit of a hobby and passion, but never really saw it as a career back then because I thought I'd be doing music full time, basically.
You have to tell the audience, what was the band that you were in then?
The band was called Hollywood Ending. It's not... If you were to search it now on Google, there's probably an American band now, a Disney band called Hollywood Ending that's taken the name. But, if people are interested, it's on Spotify and, Apple Music, YouTube, etc. So it's something that you can't really hide away from if you were to Google me. So I always kind of see it as a good thing, really, because people have different journeys into technology, right? And mine has been a non-standard journey, I would say. It's always good to kind of break stereotypes as well, really, for somebody from an Asian background into rock and metal music, playing live shows and gigs isn't the norm for someone from my background. So yeah, it's always an interesting talking point, really, when people ask me how I got into tech. Yeah, so very fortunate to do that for about 3 or 4 years while studying at university as well, when I was doing computer science. Did that quite successfully. We released an album. We did all the typical top of the pops music video type of stuff, and then towards, I think I was about 21, finishing the end of my degree, the actual label that we were signed to got bought out by a bigger label, which was Warner. And as part of the rationalization process, we were one of the artists that didn't make the cut. That kind of left me in a position where, music, I think at the time we were on the cusp of the digital music revolution. So I'm talking about 2001, 2002, when things like Napster were coming on and, people were moving to digital buying and CD sales were really going down. So it was very difficult to see a career as a musician from a financial perspective. So I was fortunate enough to land a role for the record company anyway, in a different capacity, doing website development. So that was my first kind of entry into technology, really, where I began creating and maintaining websites for artists at the time when Flash was really big. I was creating all the digital lead cards for artists with embedded web players and maintaining artist websites through the content management systems, basically. And that's kind of where I first got into a real technology role, actually, at that point, which was interesting. Still working within music, but also doing something that I enjoyed, which was website development. So that was my first kind of foray into technology after being kind of a semi-successful musician, I will say. And I think from then on, my career has taken an upwards trajectory in terms of moving into different organizations, taking roles of increasing responsibility, and moving from an engineer into more senior management, which has been a fantastic learning experience for me for the past 20 years.
So as you say, your career ascent has continued, and you've worked across multiple different companies in a variety of different sectors as well. So was that a conscious move to change sectors? And what did you learn from those experiences?
Good question. So I think when you're young and you're kind of, for example, in my situation, when I joined the first tech role that I had as a software website developer, I didn't really have any, massive career aspirations about where I wanted to go with tech. My main aim was just to enjoy something that I was doing and to be of value in the role that I was doing. I think my personal nature, in terms of the way I am, I don't like to stay still for too long in terms of from a learning perspective. And very quickly, if things start to become a bit easy, I start to get itchy feet. Is probably the best way to describe it. And I'm kind of attracted to really complex challenges. So the first move for me away from my initial role was to move back home, actually. So I was actually working in Swansea at the time for the record label, and I got a bit homesick after a few years. So I kind of moved into an opportunity for a local authority, actually. And there was no real future kind of aspiration as in a career path that I wanted to follow to take that role. It was just a case of, it seems like a very stable role, working for local government, and it will allow me to move back home and be closer to family, actually. I spent a huge amount of my time in that role, almost 7 years, actually. And I think that's where I really started to learn my trade in technology and actually becoming a leader. So, starting off as a web developer, moving into more project management, doing lots of transformation from a technology perspective around creating digital e-channels for local government, when I think the e-gov agenda was a really big thing in 2005, 2006, creating transactional capabilities, doing infrastructure migrations, data center modernizations. And that's where I really started to think about my career, actually, and think about how far I could potentially extend myself and see how far I could go. I think within local government, you get to a certain point where you kind of hit the ceiling of your kind of career path, actually. And I kind of reached that point about 7 years in, where unless I wanted to do more of a customer service focused role, because IT gets lumbered with different other functions, either finance or something else, there wasn't really a more senior role or a senior path that I could follow from a tech perspective to kind of stay with an organization. And that's where I started to look elsewhere. And, fortunate enough that my name had somehow managed to get around my local network and the industry as somebody who had been successful within that role. And actually, from then on, I moved roles to a different organization. And it wasn't a case of it's a different domain. It was more about the challenge, because ultimately, the majority of the technology problems are fairly universal. They don't really vary from industry to industry. You're always looking at some kind of modernization, simplification, tech debt remediation, building capability. It was more around the scale of the actual problem and the challenge and the value that I could bring. It just so happens to be that every time I've moved to a different domain, but I kind of anchored on those core principles that technology is fairly universal. And it's also been interesting for me to see how these different domains works, and if there is any slight nuances from a tech perspective, and it keeps me fresh as well from a learning perspective, and keeps me kind of interested and actually motivated as well. So it's not ever been like a conscious choice. It just happened to be the opportunities that have opened up for me have been in different sectors, and the opportunities have been exciting, and the challenges are complex enough for me to be interested and realize that can add real value. So I've always taken those and kind of grasped those opportunities, because they serve as a great kind of advancement for personal growth as well. So yeah, that's just been my mindset, is the more difficult the challenge, the more attracted I was to it, and I see it as a growth opportunity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the great things about working in technology is how highly transferable it actually is. So it's great that you've had experience across all those different sectors. But you spent nearly 5 years with the BBC, enjoying a very successful career, deploying solutions to over 25,000 employees across those both national and international sites. I think you then went and joined Barclays as the CTO for infrastructure and strategy, and then more recently you've started with GSK. So what's it been like joining an organisation in the middle of a global pandemic?
Interesting. I don't think summarizes everything. I think for the most part, I've been surprised at how well the organizations have adapted to onboarding people remotely, which kind of surprised me because I'm an individual that really thrives off like personal interactions actually, and I was kind of a bit concerned about not having those corridor conversations with people, and especially when you're new, that kind of face-to-face contact is hugely important as you kind of create your brand within the organization and create that trusted network of like stakeholders and just to help people in general really. So I'd say that had its own challenges remotely because it's difficult to have those regular coffee conversations with people, especially when you're new and everything's quite regimented, and your diary is a combination of 30-minute intros with people from all around the organization really. But I think thankfully I've been able to build those relationships quite effectively and started to deliver value quite early on, especially when I went into Barclays and now at GSK. I've just been fortunate enough that my natural style has lended itself to creating those relationships quite early on and actually just helping people in some of their big problems. So I think the learning curve for me throughout all of this was more of the fact that it is within our gift to be able to do this remotely, and now we're getting into the blend of, well, how do we kind of fit into the new kind of modern way of working where we're kind of part in the office, part not in the office. But yeah, it was a great learning experience, and I think more so than anything, it just proved to me that as long as you have the right capability and a mindset and the willingness to kind of do well and build those relationships, whether it's remote or not, or whether it's a pandemic of this nature, you can be effective quite early on as long as you have the right mindset.
Absolutely agree. So you mentioned about your move to Barclays. How did you find that transition to being a CTO compared to some of the other senior roles that you've held?
It was an interesting transition. So in my role previous to that at the BBC, I was very heavily operationally focused, very embedded within execution from a delivery perspective, and that was the beaten drum of that organization, really. So I was very used to working in a certain way with like lots of suppliers, with like product squads within the BBC to kind of continuously execute on the actual product roadmap. So moving from a very operational role, being hands-on, I guess having lots of budgetary responsibility as well, moving into more of an influencing role at kind of Barclays, looking after strategy and architecture for the bank. It was a bit of a shift for me personally, because you move away from being in a day-to-day mindset of fixing operational issues, trying to unblock issues with the delivery, for example, to be more of an influencer and more of a listener. So I really had to adapt my style actually quite early on within Barclays to kind of move away from that operational mindset to kind of active listening and thinking about technology from an enablement perspective, because a lot of the time you're acting as a consultant within that role to understand what the problems are, how the particular product area sees their area evolving, and actually what technology capabilities they need to be successful. So it was an interesting transition because I learned quite a lot moving from being operationally focused into that role. And as a result of that, you have to then adapt to your style as well in terms of the way you not just interact with people, but also the way that you listen, also the way that you make recommendations, what your kind of consulting network within the organization looks like, how you gain feedback, how you kind of validate assumptions. It was a different experience for me, especially in a global bank where you have to deal with a lot of international colleagues in the US and in India as well. So it wasn't an easy transition for me to make actually, because I've been so used to that operational world for kind of 5 years, working with suppliers, that when you kind of leave that and get into this kind of advisory role, it is a bit of a mindset shift actually for you to make. And it took me some time to get that right. I'd say about six months to kind of get that right before I really felt comfortable in the actual role that I was doing.
What is your current focus and priorities at GSK then?
So it's a really interesting time at GSK as we're looking to create a brand new world-class consumer healthcare business, which I've joined. So it really is a unique opportunity for me, and part of the attraction to start from a position of zero in some aspects and building up the technology capability from scratch. So a lot of the focus right now is not just focused on, I guess, how we separate the two companies, and there's a program of work that's kind of looking at that, but then also how do we bring in the right talent for GSK Consumer Healthcare going forward, and how do we create diverse teams, or how do we build our processes and our technology kind of stacks in line with what consumer healthcare wants to be as well. So it really is a unique opportunity, kind of semi-greenfield actually, where you can take all your learnings from previous organizations, what's worked well, what hasn't, what you wish you could have changed, and start from a blank slate actually, and try and influence things in the right way so you set yourself up for success from day one actually. So that's the bulk of the activity right now as you kind of go through it. So most of my time is spent on that, on building that capability within the organization right now, hiring people, finding talent, for example, and making sure that we can set up the tech function to be world-class day one.
You mentioned having a diverse team, and I know you're particularly passionate about creating diversity and inclusion within your technology team. So how are you going about building that inclusiveness and that equitable culture within the organization?
It's not easy, I would say. I think finding talent sometimes in a highly competitive market is difficult, and I think especially right now with the return to office post COVID, and people's new preferences in terms of how they want to operate, how they want to work, that presents its own challenge in finding that kind of diverse network of people that want to even apply. So there's some challenges there, but for me, I always look at ensuring that I have a good spread of like diverse individuals who can, from different industries, different walks of life, who can bring different perspectives into the team, because I think those different perspectives altogether sum up to be something that's of real value going forward. It would be very boring if we all had people who kind of thought like, right, from same backgrounds, because then we would get very kind of uniform approaches to how we kind of solve problems. So I've always tried to bring in these different perspectives from quite an early part of my career, because I've seen firsthand the value that diverse teams bring. So it's the same here at GSK actually, as we're interviewing people, we're looking more so for, I guess, the personal experience, not just the technical ability and capability. I've worked with lots of people in my career who are very good on paper. They have they have a lot of accreditations, degrees, courses, but struggle to put that into practice at some time. So I'd rather have the attitude and that kind of personal element for me that kind of weighs a bit more heavily for me than the technical aspect sometimes. But it's not easy, and I think as most organisations, we are striving to get better in identifying diverse talent across the organisation. So there's lots of schemes in place through early learning programs, graduate schemes, where we're trying to build that pipeline in to take somebody from that early career into a future leader as well. But it's just a refinement process, Dave. If I'm being honest, there's no formula for it. It's really trial and error. You find some gems as you go through the process, but then you're kind of in competition for that gem with about 5 or 6 companies, because they also see the same things that kind of you do. So it's not easy, but it's always in the back of your mind to be able to kind of build that team day one.
That's a great approach that you're taking there. So what have been your career highlights to date, and what do you think has been your proudest moment so far?
Interesting. I think what I've really enjoyed in all of my roles is developing people, actually. And I think what really gives me satisfaction more so than delivering a project, or it might be commercial savings, I think these are all things that are expected of you as part and parcel of your role, but identifying talent where you can develop that talent and then see that individual go on to bigger and better things, either within your organization or outside your organization to senior roles is a really important thing for me, and that brings me a lot of happiness actually. And there's been a few examples of that for people that I've worked with in the past who I've mentored and developed and coached, who have now gone on to fantastic senior roles in large multinational organizations, and that brings me a sense of fulfillment actually, and joy that I've been able to help them in some way be able to gain more confidence in their abilities and actually giving them the runway to be successful, which has resulted in them landing these super roles. So I think that for me is probably the biggest achievement that I would say, rather than anything specifically work related.
And what's the best bit of advice that you've actually received during your career? And what advice would you give to others who are perhaps just starting out on this journey now?
So there's two things that I would say that have kind of guided me throughout my career. One is the concept of self-awareness. And what I mean by that is, I think when you're young and coming into a technology role, and this is just a consequence of, I guess, being in that age, we all think we know more than we do, right? And I've been guilty of that. It's like when you're getting challenged by your parents who are trying to give you a bit of wisdom and you think you know it all. So it's the similar kind of thing, I guess, when you're starting out is, I would say just be self-aware in terms of taking feedback effectively and using that in a constructive way to work on your weaknesses, actually. So I think it's an important piece of advice that I got quite early on, because it kind of makes you reflect quite deeply in terms of where you are from a maturity perspective. So, getting some form of 360 feedback, or even just somebody who's going to mentor you to kind of point out to you areas that you may be excelling in or areas that you might need to kind of work on is hugely important for anyone with aspirations of like moving up the career ladder, for example. So I think self-awareness is key for me, and I would encourage anyone out there who's starting out to find someone who they can not only see them helping them in that space, but also act as like a bit of a mentor as well going forward. And that's something that I did, so I passed that on. And then the last piece of advice I got was somebody who I actually know quite well. We kind of grew up together, but as I was moving into more senior roles, I asked him for, what's the biggest advice you could give me in this particular role, and he just said this line which kind of stuck with me, which was to slow down your walk. And I didn't really get it at first, but what he meant is as you get more senior, don't forget to make sure that you look around at people who are wanting to speak to you or looking for advice from you. So be approachable. So if you're moving from meeting to meeting, don't rush, slow down your walk, observe around you what's kind of going on, and always remain approachable for a conversation, even if that means being late for a meeting sometimes. So I kind of use that principle quite a lot, really, to make sure that I'm always approachable and available. I kind of make it known that if anyone wants to speak to me as well, that I'm always there for a chat or a conversation, because we need to focus on the human elements of our kind of side of our role too as well, not just on the day-to-day task oriented stuff. So yeah, those are the two things that I would say for anyone listening that certainly has worked for me as some of the things that helped shape me to where I've got to today.
Well, I think that's absolutely great advice. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Usman. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you again for sharing those career insights and your experiences with our audience. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for having me on. And I hope anyone listening found that useful to hear a little story from a boy from Rochdale. So thank you very much.
Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and stay tuned for more inspiring tech leaders.